Are we good?
Looks good.
Excellent. Perfect. Go for it.
Okay. Just one more thing here. I need to hide the floating meat controls. Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks for having us here to talk about this topic. So yeah, my name is Cory. I'm a PhD student of cognitive science from Jyväskylä University in Finland, although I'm currently residing in Minnesota. And my emphasis has been on my PhD hiatus building the Archdisciplinary Research Center. So I'll talk about archdisciplinarity in a moment here, but I should probably preface with a couple of things. First, Michael, I'm curious, how much time do we have today for these?
So typically we go an hour. I actually can go longer, so take as long as you want, and whoever has to go will drop off. Otherwise, but we'll keep going. So
Okay.
if you talk for just under an hour, and then we have as much discussion as people want, then that's
Okay. Yeah, so for context here, obviously I'll be going first. I'm going to be presenting some foundations for the conversation. And then I'll hand it off to Brendan. And then Brendan will relate this to sociality. And then we'll hand it off to Bobby. And then Bobby has his integrated evolutionary synthesis, and he has some associations. Generally, as is the case when doing scientific investigation, we often have multiple people who make mutual discoveries all at the same time. And so us three have been having ideas that are in this space. And in the context of ARC, the Archdisciplinary Research Center, we're coming together and sharing our ideas and advancing forward. So yeah, this presentation is on advancing beyond Gödel's theorems, and I understand that this is quite a claim to be making. So I am going to have a lot of references here, and just keeping an eye on time, I'm actually going to run a timer for myself so I can see how long it's taken me. Probably won't go into details of every single thing here, but Michael, I did update the slides. I'll send you the slides, and then if people want to see the slides after and see all the references, they'll be there, and all the references are at the end.
just to be clear. Are you advancing slides? Because we're still seeing the title slide.
Yep, I just have the title slide here.
All right, great.
Okay, so here we go. So overview. So to give an overview of what I'm going to do here is I'm going to first talk about scopes and scales of inquiry to give a larger context in which this inquiry belongs. And then I'm going to touch on historical precursors that have led up to Gödel. And I'm going to talk about two different lineages. I'm going to talk about meta-cognition and meta-language. And then I'm going to bring these together in something that I propose called fractal phase transformations. And then I'll be relating it directly to Gödel's theorems. And then I'm going to carry this forward with something we're calling arches, which are archetypal patterns of nature, or what we're proposing to be natural laws that can hold across Gödel iterations. And then I'll give a couple of examples in terms of application. And then I'll relate it to computational boundaries and put forth a hypothesis, which was actually the reason why I reached out to you originally. So here we go. So scopes and scales of inquiry. So there's a lot of different vocabulary that people can use to describe the evolution of human understanding. And they all have pros and cons. But for this presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on disciplinary language to give a context. So we all know what a discipline is. You're anchored in one particular domain, and then you borrow from other domains or other disciplines to do your theory and practice in that particular discipline. And interdisciplinarity is when the anchoring is released, and then you work jointly across multiple disciplines to understand whatever it is that you're trying to understand, to develop better theories and practices to advance. There's another kind of disciplinarity, which is called transdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity broadens to include any and all disciplines that are needed in order to understand a given problem and advance in theory practices. So when we have disciplinarity, people generate theories. When we have interdisciplinarity, people start to generate what are called meta-theories, which can be a theory about itself, but in general, it's theory about other theories. Transdisciplinarity, we introduce a term called unification meta-theory. This is when people start to fit together all domains of human understanding into big picture frameworks, theory of everything frameworks. So archdisciplinarity is advancing in scopes of inquiry. So archdisciplinarity is the scope of academic inquiry that treats big picture, theory of everything, unification, meta-theoretical frameworks as units of analysis. So we basically, what we do is we look across these different efforts that people have made to fit together all human knowledge into something coherent, and then we look at what they have in common. And then this derives what we call arches, which are these archetypal patterns in nature, which I'll be getting to in a bit here. Okay, so historical precursors. So from the ancient world through the Age of Enlightenment into the industrial era, people have been trying to define what the fundamental properties of cognition are, what the fundamental properties of reasoning are, what the fundamental properties of our capacity to simulate reality are. And when we look across the diversity of different expressions that people provide, we find that there's actually recurring characteristics. And even though people have different frameworks, these recurring characteristics persist. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but just to note that this has been a long-standing inquiry that people have been making. So the first lineage that we're going to look at is meta-cognition. And although there's a tremendous amount of literature that could be referenced here, I'm going to focus primarily on developmental psychology or developmental behaviorism. And it starts with Piaget. So Piaget was interested in understanding reasoning in children. And he did scientific investigations and ran instruments and basically came up with different stages that people go through as they grow their cognitive development. And he wrote a book at the end of his life on equilibration of cognitive structures. And he proposed that whenever an individual goes, or child, goes from one stage of cognitive complexity to the next, there's a repeating pattern, which is assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration. So with assimilation, you get new ideas or new behaviors, new ways of thinking or doing get brought in, and then it has to accommodate, you have to accommodate it with what you already know and understand. And then if you can fit it together through an equilibration process, then you produce a higher level of behavior. So Kurt Fischer and Michael Commons were students of Piaget, and they both had the same idea, and they created their own frameworks building on and going beyond. And one of the things they share in common was the idea that actually, once you reach adulthood, stages of cognitive development continue. And so they proposed their own frameworks. Fischer put forth dynamic skill theory, and Michael Commons put forth a model of hierarchical complexity. And I don't have time to go into all of the details here. Brendan will actually go into the model of hierarchical complexity a bit more when he presents his slides. But the idea is that we can identify specific stages of development that are domain general and then take on different content. But the thing that we're going to look at here in particular is that Fischer put forth skill development as actions, single actions, action mappings, and action systems, which maps onto Piaget's assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration. And Commons was interested in moving beyond the qualitative into the quantitative, and took a really hardline behaviorist approach. And so, like, he also has something called transition dynamics, which is these different transition steps along thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which I'm going to talk about the transitions a little bit later when we get to fractal phase transformation. So Sarah Ross was a colleague of Commons, and she came to the realization that actually the transition dynamics are fractal. So human behavior is fractal. And again, I'll be explaining this in more detail in a moment here, but this is where I came in. They basically plucked me out of obscurity and were my supervisors when I did my master's degree. And what I did was I aligned Gödel's theorems with behavioral complexity. And this means advancing from behavioral complexity to fractal phrase transformations that hold for any system. So I made the move to say, so we have this transformational process that's taken place, but this transformation isn't just in people, it also is in the universe writ large, and actually applies to any given domain. And this also comes with the addition of the notion that human intelligence, therefore, is an organismic expression of more universal processes in nature. And I also introduced diagonal complexity, and Michael Commons and others had been using horizontal and diagonal horizontal and vertical complexity. Horizontal is how many bits you have at a given level, and then vertical complexity is how many stacks of coordination you're making at each of those levels. Diagonal complexity is when the output of one level can be the input of another level that's not directly related to it. Meanwhile, and then this was actually the lineage I looked at when I did my master's. Meanwhile, while the meta-cognition line was going, there was the meta-language line that was going. So Cantor had worked with transfinite numbers. That means you have an infinite set of elements, and then in each element, that element can contain within itself an infinite number of elements. And Hilbert was really interested in these kinds of things, put forth like a 20-odd question sheet of things that needed to get answered for mathematics. One of these was, are there consistent axioms for mathematics? Because when we're talking about transfinite numbers and in infinite sets, can we say anything that is going to be universally true? Hilbert gave a presentation, I think it was at Princeton, like in the mid-1920s. Gödel, a student, was there and decided to take on this question, and he came up with the incompleteness and completeness theorems. So basically, he came up with a really clever way of mapping on variables and operations and formulas into something called Gödel numbering. And then he ran prime factorization, which basically allowed him to build an infinite number of stacking formulas, but always be able to trace them back down. And he showed that a formal system of axioms cannot be complete and consistent at the same time. So there's a general misconstruing that people have that says that, oh, well, this means that there's just relative of knowledge and we can never really know anything that's true. But that's not actually what Gödel was putting forth, because you're essentially stacking new formulas on the stability of the previous formulas that already exist. So you can say that you have a way of, well, I'll come back to this just in a second, because Tarski came along and said, actually, this applies to all languages. Any formal language will find that this is also the case. And he put forth something called truth functions. And truth functions was his attempt to define the fundamental statements that are made in languages to define things that are true. So Alan Turing, we all know him from his work in machine intelligence, but when he did his PhD dissertation, he did it on a system of logic based on ordinals, which in my opinion, and will be seen to be the case for why in this presentation, in my opinion, it's the most important thing that he did, because basically what he showed is that from a sufficient level of complexity, there are axioms or properties that persist through all Gödel iterations. So his supervisor was Alonzo Church, and they together worked on like the Church-Turing thesis. They worked on some other things, but the thing that I want to talk about here is lambda calculus, because what Church did, basically everybody mentioned already and many other people agreed that actually there was one universal thing everyone could agree on that seemed to hold across all these iterations, and that was recursion, primitive recursion. What Church did is he tried to create a language, a mathematical logical language so he called it the simple theory of types. And if you look at the paper, it's not simple, but the idea behind it is simple, which is that you have types, and then you have operations, and then you have functions or formulas. And then the formulas become a new type. And then this process recurses, it repeats over and over and over again. So you can see now the relationship, perhaps, with metacognition and meta-language, because in metacognition, they're defining the cognitive stages that take place universally across human development, across their species. But here, these guys were trying to describe the mathematical underpinnings of it. But neither of these groups knew about each other, and they didn't work together. Gödel revisited this in 1944 and basically said it himself, that we need to move beyond numbers, functions, and geometrical figures, start thinking about classes, relations, and combinations of symbols when we're trying to understand the fundamental properties of cognition, of our capacity to process information. And I have a Chomsky reference in here because he applied some of this stuff in terms of the recursivity of human grammar that holds across our species. But that falls outside the bounds, I think, here to get into the details of that. So what I've proposed is fractal phase transformation. So the dark gray up at the top is the framework that I'm proposing. And then the lighter gray boxes in the middle, you have Hilbert and Tarski, which are from the meta-language camp, and then Commons, Fisher, and Piaget from the metacognition camp. And of course, we can go back to the precursor slide, and there's a bunch of things that we could take and do alignments, but there's just not enough space in here in this table to have them all in. And of course, there's a whole lot of other literature that I integrated in doing this. So this is just a slice of a larger pie here. But basically, what I'm saying is that you can line up the fundamental properties that were being articulated in both of these lineages into a larger kind of a coordination. So, and then we can associate these to Gödel's theorems. So I'm just going to run through this, and I'm going to try to be as brief as possible without losing too much information here. But the general idea is that there is an order, a magnitude of architectural or processual stacking of complexity. And this consists of a static, a dynamic, and a multidynamic transition. And by multidynamic, I mean a hypernym for the synthesis of static and dynamic. So each of these transitions is associated with a particular kind of operation. So static is associated with satisfiability, dynamic is associated with junctures, and multidynamic is associated with collation. Each of these transitions have states, and it is a fractal. So each one has its own states that are fractal versions of the transitions. So static has its primary operator as satisfiability, but it goes through a satisfiability, a juncturing, and a collation state. And similarly with juncturing, and similarly with collation transitions. And so in vernacular language, the way it goes is that you have something that exists by itself and in space, and the thing has relationships to other things in space, but they're not necessarily junctured yet. But they're junctured in the space context, but not directly to each other. And then this forms a set. So in this set, going into the dynamic transition, then a juncturing operator or a junctioning operation takes place. So if we're running this forward as a forward computation, things can join. And if we run this backwards, then it's disassembly and things disjoin. So when things can join, that becomes a set in of itself. And then the multidynamic transition has to do with an intermeshing of the two or more things into their interiorities so that the subsets become intermeshed and intertwined. So when we look at what Fisher and Piaget were talking about, and we map this in, And then we think about this in relationship to Gödel in his theorems. Gödel has his incompleteness, which says that axioms reach, or a formula reaches a limit of proof. So, okay, let's take comments here. You have a temporary equilibrium of A, which is of a subset of a coordination of A and B or C, however many elements are there. So you have a particular framework, a way of making sense of things, a schema, but then new information gets introduced. And then you realize that your particular way of thinking and doing has a limitation. So generally people will say, absolutely not, I'm not going to look at it, my idea is right. If people do continue along the transitions, then they say, okay, this is a complementation. So there are things in this schema that are different from mine, and mine can solve some things, but this thing can solve other things. And then this arrives us at the relativism, right in the middle, where the threshold is. When people arrive at a threshold, if they're unable to do the coordination and they can't see how these things can be fit together, then it becomes relativism. And so people will oscillate. Sometimes they'll do one thing, sometimes they'll do the other, but if the transitions continue, then they construct new axiomatic proofs to overcome the axiomatic limitations that either of the previous systems had. And they do that by an intermeshing. You break the thing down into all of its composite parts, as many levels down as you need to go, and then you reassemble things back up, and you get a higher order behavior, a higher order schema, a higher level of coordination. So Gödel's theorems aren't limitations to our understanding. They're natural procedural expressions in mathematics for this recurring process that happens every time we go up a stage of development. Okay, so the idea of universals that hold across Gödel iterations. So we call these arches for lack of better terminology. But arches does have some usefulness in terms of its etymology. So it's what we've settled on. And as I said before, arches are archetypes of nature, or what we are proposing to be natural laws. So there are things that persist through these iterations. And I've color-coded here to make it easy to kind of see what I'm talking about. So the first one here is universal calculability, which we've been talking about before. And you basically, if you look on the left-hand side and you have that little table, we have types, units, or entities, and then we have operations, relations, or actions that happen between them, and then they integrate together into function systems and eventities, and then this recurses. This procedure recurses, and then it creates a stack. And this happens over and over and over again in any domain across any scale. So what this does is it affords us a universal measure. So obviously in human affairs, we have different means of doing measurement, but they're human constructed. And so what this allows us to do is to base our measurement on the recursions that are naturally innate in nature. So we also have arch of complexity, which is characterized by three kinds of complexity: vertical, horizontal, and diagonal, which I previously said some things about. And so what vertical complexity does is it counts the recursive stacks. Horizontal counts how many bits, units, entities, or what have you at a given phase or a given level. And then the diagonal is the output, where the output of one phase becomes the input of another that's not directly related. So as I'm going into speaking about fractals here, I think it's important to take just a moment to explain a little bit more about what I mean by fractal phase transformation and why I use this terminology. Because when we're talking about, so first of all, there's a fractal replication of properties that hold across all the iterations in a self-similar way. The phase language comes from the notion of phase space, because what we're really doing is we're accounting for all possible states and changes that can happen in a given system based on the fundamental attributes that underpin any given system. And then, of course, the transformation part is because we're looking at the fractal phase transformation. It is transformational. It's showing how things in one step to the next with no black box, how changes are actually taking place as things become more complex. We also have the arch of permeation boundaries, which basically is just being able to differentiate between internality, externality, and what's holding across. So we all know what subject and object means. Transject is a term that I and Vervaeke both seem to have coined at the same time. We have slightly different meanings to the word, but what I mean to convey and what does carry over into his sense of it is things that persist across the building blocks. So these would be things like time and space and energy. So, so what I'm demonstrating here is that there are universal things that seem to be really reliable that can help us have a universal measure. And of course, this is like the point of science, is like we want to get really good at measuring things. We want to get really good at being able to systematize what we know. And we want to have a means of doing relations between different bodies of knowledge on some universal underlying agreeable consensus. And so this is what we're proposing with arches, is that this can assist us in these endeavors. So I have 3 examples here, arches in application, and I'm going to go through all of these each together for each of the transitions. So in physics, we have the example of 2 hydrogen atoms existing in space. This is a static transition. In biology, the static transition being 2 neurons existing in space, and then sociology, 2 people existing in space. The juncturing or the transition dynamic for physics is that neutrons and electrons attract via electromagnetic force. In biology, synaptic relation via neurotransmitter, and in sociology, people sharing ideas with each other. And then in the multidynamic, we have the diatomic molecule forming through sharing of electrons. So now we have the intermeshing. It's not just a field of force that's bringing them together, but there's an actual intermeshing of the components. In biology, you have the axionic transmission between neurons. So it's not just a firing off from the synapse to the dendrites, or, it's not just the connection between the 2 things, but there's an intermeshing. So what's going on in one neuron is having an impact on what's going on inside the other neuron. And then, of course, in sociology, we have different ideas being mutually fitted together. So it's not just me saying something to you, it's not just you saying something to me, but we're both doing an internal transformation of our ideas based on our what we share in common, what our shared values are, what our different ideas are, and how we can fit those different ideas together. And then this will relate to what Brendan will be talking about. So arches and computational boundaries. There are 3 more arches here, and I'm seeing them at 25 minutes, so I'll try and wrap this up in the next 5 or so. So there are other arches. There's integrative levels. Integrative levels basically attempt to ascertain the fundamental properties that characterize how different levels are related to each other. So I'll give an example. One example is that whenever a new level emerges, it has a new emergent property that didn't exist from the previous level. So if you think about hydrogen atoms forming a molecule is characteristically going to be different than the atoms themselves. A neural network is going to be characteristically different than an individual neuron. A kinship or a friendship or a family or an institution is going to be different than an individual. Another example of integrative levels would be that each new stack is built on the equilibrium of the previous stack. So when we're talking about advancing the evolution of human understanding through scopes such as archdisciplinarity, it doesn't make obsolete any of the previous scopes of inquiry. We're building on their stability, and these things are always going to go on, and they're always going to inform as we continue to evolve. And so integrative levels usually come with, they're usually populated by universal classes in the literature. So for example, Greg Henriquez has his unified theory of knowledge, and he populates it with energy, matter, life, mind, and culture. And then he has different building blocks that exist in these different domains. And then when we're talking about universal processes, we're talking about things like we find in human domain-specific frameworks, such as Kohlberg has different stages of moral development. Erik Erikson has stages of psychosocial development. Susanna Cook-Bruder has stages of ego development. But we also have human domain general frameworks as well. And you can see here Piaget, Fisher, Commons describing stages of development that can take different content, but it's the same behavioral form. And then, of course, we have universal processes expressed in nature in general. So evolutionary theories, environmental epigenetics. I make proposals for what I call process ratiocinators, which falls outside the bounds of this presentation. But it's just to say that there are frameworks that try and describe universal processes. So when we're looking at, and this is kind of like, this is like a long-winded way of getting to the original hypothesis I had here, which is that computational boundary is determined by how many stacks of fractal phase transformations can occur within an entity as it coordinates itself in its environment. So the thing that's interesting to me, the question I have is when we're looking at goal states of entities, we're looking at the boundaries upon which they can compute reality. We have to increase the granularity that we have in order to be able to do this as efficiently and effective as possible. And there's a whole lot of reasons why this can be an important thing to explore. And I'm now almost at 30 minutes here. But what I want to say is that if an organism only has a certain number of recursive stacks that its biological morphology allows, or its latent capacity that it's been able to grow within itself, whatever this limitation is, if the universe itself has universal architectures and universal processes, and there's a certain number of stacks of recursion in which is required for reality to be able to process this, then for organisms, you can do a one-to-one correspondence to the architectural and processual capacities that a given entity has in order for it to operate on that space. And I have other theorems that I have produced that can perhaps help articulate this. But this is, anyways, the hypothesis that I want to leave off on. So I do have a couple pages of references here. And like I said, I'll give these updated slides to Michael. And so if anyone wants to have them in their own files, they'll be there. If anyone's interested in having a conversation with me or Brendan or Bobby, or is interested in how your work might be related, you can visit our website, arc.voyage. There's a form there, and I'm sure somewhere else there's like a place or two where you can do direct email from your inbox. So yeah, that's my my presentation. And I need to stop sharing my screen. Or should I keep it up for a moment? No.
Slideshow. Okay.
Better?
Yes.
All right. All right. Lovely. All right. Cool. Well, yes. Thanks again. This is exciting. I'm just gonna kind of pick up from this sort of architecture that Cory's laid out and dig into maybe applications at the cultural level, which he's sort of already intimated a little bit in discussing sort of the sociological, ways that this can manifest. My background is in the humanities. So I'm kind of coming at this more from the angle of sociology of knowledge, worldview, orientation, values, and meta-narratological meaning structures that people make in society based on information in culture.
And the argument here will be that we can see this pattern at work at this level of analysis. So just 5 basic points. This probably won't go as long, maybe just 15 minutes or so, maybe less. I'm going to try to, again, make the claim that sort of cultural evolution is an instance of this recursive emergence process. I'm going to talk about the individual collective feedback cycle, as I call it, which is sort of the recursive process by which this develops. There's also what I'm calling the worldview incompleteness approach of looking at this evolutionary process in a recursive way that generates new levels of complexity, hierarchical complexity, in a kind of ongoing, incomplete way. I'm going to look at meta-modernism, which is an emerging worldview formulation or paradigm that itself is comes out of this hierarchical complexity process and is also about it. And then I'm going to propose this idea of cultural light cones in the ways that enculturated agents or entities have their kind of the goal scope and informational causal power expanded by means of the enculturation process that I'll be describing. So that's the basic outline.
Hey, Brandon,
yeah.
Just so I only need like 8 minutes. So I was just letting you know if you could.
I'll be quick.
Okay.
So this is well, Bobby, do you have to run right at 1 or
no? I'm just saying for everybody to be able to see all presentations.
Sure.
I think you should end at like 52 or something.
Sounds good. Yeah, I can do that.
Thanks.
Let me know if I'm starting to run a little bit long. So this is just a line from Bobby's book, The Romance of Reality, in which he talks about the principle of recursive self-organization. And as he'll probably be talking about in a minute, this is sort of a way of thinking about, again, some of that architecture that Cory outlined in sort of abstract terms, but seeing it basically in phenomena in the natural world and as a driver of the complexification process that we see in the universe. You see this across basically all scales of big history. Cory also mentioned the work of Greg Enriquez, who offers a nice map of the complexification process, including specific planes of complexity as they've emerged throughout the complexification process. And this is sort of a map of big history that we can look at to examine the ways in which this sort of universal computation process is unfolding through these different forms of information that are coming online through these emergent levels of complexity. So Enriquez talks about the life complexity domain emerging from from genetic information processing, mind from neuronal information processing, and culture from symbolic information processing. And the claim, I suppose, would be that you can see this architecture of recursive emergence, this architecture of these fractal phase transformations occurring at all these levels of information processing. I'm going to be looking at just the culture level, as I said. And to do that, I think we have to talk about enculturation, basically. Culture is process. So enculturation or socialization is basically the means by which individuals in a culture come to inhabit and step into the kind of cultural norms, expectations, worldviews of their particular culture. You can think about individuals sort of downloading, as it were, the goal states or the norms and values of their culture, the kind of given world model or knowledge and beliefs, certain narrative ideas, narratological, normative aspects, all this sort of a thing. Such things that sociologists talk about. And we often think about how individuals, when they enter society through means of education, pedagogy, et cetera, get enculturated into those societies. But at the same time, this actually has another aspect to it in which individuals themselves reflect upon culture and kind of help update those representations that they are enculturated with. And so we actually see that this is really a full feedback cycle in which individuals are enculturated. Themselves, they reflect upon the materials and the ideas that and the values that they were enculturated with, take them as objects of reflection, and then put those reflections back into culture by means of which then the enculturation process continues. And so you get a sort of looping and a hierarchical emergence of new levels through this process as this updating of culture continues. Sociologists talk about collective representations as being what individuals are essentially enculturated into, but then of course individuals make themselves representations of those collective representations. And so again, this sort of leads to loops that lead to new levels in the language that Bobby uses of recursive emergence. Now, so one way you can kind of think about this when you come to the perspective of worldviews that people are inhabiting is that there's a process of decentration that sort of unfolds as a person in a given worldview comes to reflect upon the collective representations of that worldview, and in a sense gets outside of them by objectifying them, and enters a sort of new space of reflection recursively by means of that initial worldview position. So there's a new vantage that becomes essentially more informationally rich and complex by means of a recursive kind of iterating process of self-reflection. So I want to argue that this is sort of the process by which we see these kinds of architectures that Cory was talking about and what Greg talks about with recursive emergence unfolding at the cultural level. Now, when we're talking about like worldview systems, I think some examples of some major epochal worldviews, we can talk about the pre-modern, modern, postmodern for now. Here I just have a little rough, heuristic of sort of this list sort of sources of knowledge, let's say, followed by kind of the boundaries of concern, maybe some of the chief values, and some kind of meta-narratological orientations that these worldviews might be said to be oriented around. And these aren't just sort of theoretical abstract notions. They manifest in cultural production as particular art and technology, philosophy, etc. So these different worldviews are essentially emerging and manifesting critiques, objective critiques of the prior worldview system from which they emerged. The modern critiques and attempts to transcend the pre-modern, the postmodern critiques the modern and attempts to transcend it, etc. And so basically, you can imagine this as the sort of worldview incompleteness manifestation of the dynamics we've been naming. The pre-modern worldview arguably hit a certain kind of axiomatic limit, you could say, sometime in the 17th century, after the many years of wars of religion, the 30 Years' War concluding, and the Treaty of Westphalia often kind of used as a demarcation point at which you can start to see the modern socio-political structure emerging. The modern worldview and its political organization, et cetera, beginning to reach limits, axiomatic limits, you could say, through the development of technologies of global impact that lead to disruptions of the ecological, environmental domain, leading to existential risk, holding capacity concerns, etc., which leads to postmodern objectifications and critique of modern presumptions and an attempt to transcend them. And I guess one of the arguments that I want to make here is that I think that we are reaching and have reached already the limits of this particular worldview system for what it is able to do in continuing this process. And we could get into some of the details of that. But I mean, the relativism actually that Cory named in his presentation and other aspects make a progressive move forward difficult if you're not able to agree to the notion of progress, if you're not able to say anything about notions of truth, et cetera. And so one of the things that we see emerging now is a meta-modern, a going meta on culture, on the postmodern, as a new worldview system is sort of emerging to meet the adaptive needs of our current moment through this sort of recursive reflective process. And further, I guess I want to make the claim that this emerging worldview, interestingly, seems to be not just emerging from that process, but actually content-wise about that process, that it is a worldview of recursively, of recursive reflection, of reflecting upon this iterative process by means of which worldviews and cultural logics themselves emerge. So there is a kind of nascent meta-modern discourse. At this point, it's probably not even that nascent. It's probably been around for about 10 years now. And I've been involved with that for almost the duration. Writers like Lena Rachel Anderson, but also philosophers, Jason Storm, sociologists, Daniel Gortz, and scientists, many of which have been named already, including Greg Enriquez, Bobby Azarian's written on metamodernism. And I would argue that the folks doing work in this lab are also sort of engaging in the sorts of the level of analysis at which this is operating. Now, one of the ideas within metamodern discourse is to actually use the model of hierarchical complexity itself in order to understand worldview recursive emergence in this sense. Daniel Gortz is a sociologist who applies the logic of recursive reflection to worldview complexification using the MHC. He articulates what he calls metamodern sociology. And this is just a quick representation chart that gives the various stages of the model of hierarchical complexity. And one of the interesting contentions that he makes, and is worth kind of considering in this context, whether we use this model or others, is that you can consider this organization, this coordination of information by means of complexity as a way of understanding symbolic complexification of the information stack as it emerges in culture. In which case you could understand basically that traditional pre-modern worldview as operating at a certain abstract logic, the modern worldview coming along and basically being able to integrate or coordinate that level of those levels of abstraction into variables with specific formal relationships. And then that in turn being superseded by a postmodern worldview, which is able actually then to see those formal relationships within broader systemic contexts, which is what places us which is what would, sort of situate one in a postmodern cultural logic, let's say, in terms of the degree of recursive reflection at which they're operating. But of course, as I noted, this has sort of reached its axiomatic limits, you could say. But a lot of the logic of systemic level thinking leads to a lot of the cultural manifestations and a lot of the ideological and meta-narratological presumptions of the postmodern worldview. And so now the argument would be that essentially this is a limitation because to the degree that it's stuck in systems, it's not able to see anything beyond the system. Interestingly, this is, I think, the point at which Gödel's incompleteness theorems themselves are presumed to not be able to point to anything beyond the fact that everything is relative. And that's partly what's changing by this move to a metamodern, meta-systematic approach, which is able to see the patterns that govern across systems, including worldviews, such that we can see patterns like the recursive reflection of fractal phase transformations, for example, occurring in the domain of culture, and we can see the patterns by which they emerge. And to kind of emphasize a point that Cory made, not only does this offer us a kind of universal measure, which would be helpful for scientists, it actually allows us something very pragmatic and important at the cultural level as we grapple with issues of alternative facts and cultural relativism, the argument that scientific knowledge is just a language game, et cetera. There's a number of limitations caused by the postmodern approach to truth, logic, and certain normative claims that are where it bumps up against its axiomatic limit. If we're able to use a meta pattern like this recursive reflective process in order to actually show by means of intrinsic factors how recursively decentered a given worldview perspective is, then we're able to hopefully break the impasse and be able to contextualize different forms of knowledge at the cultural level. And so the metamodern perspective is able to see these dynamics and basically put postmodern relativism and context into its own relative context, thereby using the very logic of eternal recursion, as I call it, to offer some kind of new sense of directionality and even normativity. So that's basically it. The notion of cultural light cones, I'm kind of just playfully suggesting, because what I want to basically suggest is that some agents exist at the level of culture. They're processing symbolic information. They're engaging with other cultural agents, and that the enculturation process itself then will be influential in terms of how those agents are able to basically establish the scope of their projected goal states. To what degree are social or cultural agents able to reflect on and consider and coordinate higher levels of recursive relationality, which will extend further as you move up the level of recursive complexification, if that makes sense. Happy to talk more about that, but I think it's an interesting thing to consider when we're not just talking about cells or entities like that, but actual human persons, and considering the enculturation process itself as a means of extending and expanding the scope of human normative goal states. So that's basically it. And hopefully I didn't have a best eye on the time, but that's I can shoot it over to you now.
You flipped the you're on the presenter notes.
Okay, sorry, what do you want me to do? Oh, let's see. There we go.
That's it.
All right. So there's been a lot of information thrown at you guys. I'm going to try to summarize and condense this. We only have a few minutes, so I'm going to go quickly through the slides. I also bit my tongue the other day, so it hurts to speak. So I'm going to try to be minimalist. So just to state clearly what Gödel's theorems say, is that with any consistent formal system that can express basic arithmetic, there exist statements about natural numbers that cannot be either proven or disproven. Such statements are true but unprovable or inherently undecidable. And there's a little difference between those two, but we won't get into that here. So some interpreted this as meaning basically undermining the very notion of truth and question whether mathematics was a means to discern truth, echoing the popular postmodern sentiments of the time. However, I think this is a superficial interpretation of Gödel's theorem. And what he was really showing was basically Gödel opened a door to understanding the structure of mathematical systems and, as we've argued, the structure of reality more generally. So while incompleteness at one level can be addressed by formulating a meta-system, so that's how you deal with these undecidable statements. You can create a meta-system and make those statements axioms. That meta-system will have its own undecidable statements. So basically you get into this game of having to create this kind of infinite hierarchy of meta-systems, meta-mathematical systems, but that's not bad. That's kind of what we have to do with science when emergent phenomena arise and we have to create a new domain of science. So I was looking for Cory's theory before I met him. And when I met him, we didn't even realize that we were looking for the same thing. So that was kind of nice. But so while each system might not be complete in itself, the iterative process of generating higher level systems offers a means to grapple with self-referential propositions. What we get is a recursive process of meta-system creation that maps onto nature's process of recursive self-organization and hierarchical emergence. So poetic meta-naturalism is the name for this philosophy that I use in my book that corresponds to what I call the integrated evolutionary synthesis, which combines basically thermodynamics and evolutionary theory and information theory to give us a sort of a unified picture of evolution at all levels in the cosmic evolution process. This name, you could use whatever name you want for this non-reductive theory of everything, strives to be a formal theory of the process of recursive self-organization. A Gödelian reality is a creative universe that generates new levels of emergence through far from equilibrium phase transitions, where parts come together to form wholes, which become parts for the next level of emergent complexity in the nested hierarchy. So the idea is that each emergence gives rise to a phenomenon that is a new domain of science, and that new domain of science will have new causal dynamics and require new formalisms beyond the formalisms that described everything from the previous regimes. And we'll go through examples on the next slide. But basically, as I mentioned to Michael earlier, this idea of organisms being embodied theories about how to survive has the continuity with the creation of scientific theories, because basically in this picture, evolution is just a process that accumulates knowledge in the biosphere. There's no distinction between organisms and the theories and models that organisms make. So examples of self-reference we'll see in the next slide: self-organization, self-maintenance, self-amplification, self-awareness all involve a recursive process that utilizes loops in some way or another, allowing the system to reference itself. So new emergences can be understood as the universe inventing new kinds of phenomena, dynamics, mathematics, and novel self-referential phenomena. You too are part of this process. The moment you experience a paradigm shift or new understanding of yourself as an agent with a mind, a new neural attractor is created that corresponds to a new level of awareness. We can call this meta-awareness. And that's analogous to the jump from basic awareness to self-awareness. But meta-awareness in this context would be realizing you're part of a larger system, a collective. And as Michael points out, all systems are actually collective systems. So it's just realizing that and taking that seriously. So life, for example, when biology emerges, we need a new kind of causal mechanics to explain agents. And prior to agents, fundamental physics like Newton's equations explain the dynamics of the world, pretty much, besides chaotic systems. But basically, we could predict the path of a system with Newtonian equations, which are pretty simple. But when you get agents, when you get life, that's no longer the case. You have goal-oriented systems that can that pursue goals and that can choose the path that they take. There's no predicting what path they'll take. You can only predict the end goal, but you can do that with biology, cybernetics, complex adaptive systems, and the free energy principle, because the system's going to try to minimize free energy, which basically says it's going to try to stay in an attractor. It's going to try to meet that goal state. So then you get the emergence of brains and minds. So you get new causal dynamics, new types of computation, the prefrontal cortex ability to imagine and set goals in the far future. That's like literally when you imagine things there, that corresponds to type of neural computation that is different than what brainless organisms do. And in some ways the same, but there's novelty at each new level. So to understand things at that level, we need things like the Bayesian brain hypothesis, global workspace theory, IIT, Zaffron's integrated world modeling theory, which kind of puts all of those things together in a nice way that's in line with this framework. You get collectives and societies. That was Brendan's whole presentation. So we need things like, I personally like territory management theory and this idea of non-zero sum games, economic theories. This is the last slide. So this is a summary. This poetic meta-naturalism, and I'll explain why that's the name, says reality is open. It's not this static thing. It's creative. So Gödel's incompleteness theorem suggests that every system contains statements that cannot be proven within the system. A Gödelian theory of reality acknowledges its own incompleteness and instructs us on how to update itself. So we can do that using Bayes' theorem. By being aware of its own completeness, the theory becomes in some sense complete, and the model can be said to be self-aware. So it's a completely incomplete theory of everything because it acknowledges its own incompleteness. Every theory of everything will always be incomplete because new things are going to emerge. If we apply Gödel's logic to the recursive emergence model, we should expect every new level of reality to bring new phenomena that cannot be fully described using the mathematical and conceptual tools from the previous levels. So we might need things like, for example, Judea Pearl's causal calculus is being used to explain agency by people like Eric Hole, and consciousness by Tononi and Larissa Albantankis. However, since there are the same basic scale invariant or scale-free patterns at every level, system dynamics or properties at one level can be used to predict the dynamics of properties of structurally and functionally similar systems at other levels. And that's what the big thing about this is, I think. So it has predictive power that no reductionist theory of everything has. You can actually find out things about, for example, if you believe that human society is forming like a noosphere, like Teilhard de Chardin said, this collective intelligence, you can understand things about that mind that's emerging by understanding human minds, for example. Reality is inherently creative because it is always producing novel patterns that are rhymes on the patterns of the past. And that's why I call it poetic meta-naturalism. It's a kind of a spin off Sean Carroll's poetic naturalism, which is actually a reductionist theory. So this meta-naturalism means that there's meta-systems constantly being formed. So it's completely the opposite of a reductionist theory. So history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes because it's the same pattern being realized at higher levels, but with each higher level, there's an elaboration. So it's like reality's recursive emergence process is kind of like a poem that's repeating, but continuously getting more elaborate. Because of our models of reality will always have some uncertainty and incompleteness, the line between the physical and the metaphysical will never be completely clear. So this says the demarcation problem that Popper and many people really cared about is not a problem that will go away. We have to embrace it because we never know. For example, we could think that mind reading or something that's considered to be supernatural, we could find a mechanism like a cognitive entanglement, for example, and then that previously anti-scientific, pseudoscientific idea could be absorbed by the current scientific paradigm, and it would extend it. So yes, we have to be humble and understand that we can never fully know like what's science and what's